Go ye therefore, and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. Matthew 28:19-20. In the 1st century AD, Christ gave this great commission to the disciples. The result of the disciples receiving this commission was the rapid, explosive spread of the gospel around the world. These disciples truly believed that they carried the cure to the world's problem of sin. Because they believed in what they were commissioned with, they boldly went into all the world with the gospel. Since the spring of 2021, Apple Valley Baptist Church in Wenatchee, Washington has sent 7 different teams on mission trips to Zambia, Africa. The goal of these trips was for our church to become personally involved in fulfilling the Great Commission, like the first church in Jerusalem. On the first of these trips, there were 4 of us young adults from our church in Wenatchee. We worked with my parents' ministry in the capital city of Lusaka, where I had spent 4 years when I was a teenager. During that trip, we were given opportunities to help with preaching, teaching music and how to lead singing, and also we were given opportunities to work with the children and youth of the church. That trip really opened the eyes of our church to the need in Zambia. We saw personally how open the country of Zambia was, and our church began to pray about the possibility of sending more teams to Zambia in the future. In the spring of 2022, our church sent the next team to Zambia, again to work in Lusaka with my family. Towards the end of the trip, there was a man in a city about 9 hours away from Lusaka that texted Pastor Mears. He was a friend of someone in Lusaka who had gotten saved, and he wanted someone to come to Mangu to show him the gospel. There wasn't much time left before the team had to return to the States, but they drove out to Mangu to spend a couple days of Bible studies with that man. They met with him and 3 of his friends in the evening after driving most of the day to Mangu. The man who had gotten saved in Lusaka shared his salvation testimony with his friends, and Pastor Mears preached the gospel to them. Afterwards, they all called out to Christ to save them. The next morning, those new believers went out with some of the team members and evangelized and invited people to an impromptu church service that night. 28 people came to that service and heard how they could be saved, and many of those that came to that service accepted the gospel. This was the beginning of a new church plant in the city of Mangu. The believers there were excited about the gospel, and they were hungry to learn more about the Bible. One of them wrote in a text to Pastor Mears that since he was now born again, he was excited to share his faith with others in his community. Although our church sent several teams to Zambia and Mangu after that trip, God didn't open up the door for me personally to return to Zambia until January of 2023. On this trip, my wife and I spent almost 3 months in Zambia. The primary purposes of this trip were to survey the open doors in Zambia, to work with the church plant in Mangu, and to pray about whether or not God would have us to return to Zambia in a more permanent way. On this trip, we spent the majority of our time in Mangu working with the new church plant. During our time there, God showed himself mighty and opened up many doors for us. One of the doors God opened for us was to go into a school to preach the gospel and to present all the teachers with a copy of the Bible. The headmaster of the school gathered up 400 to 500 students together in the field and asked me to preach to them. The students all stood in the sun for about 45 minutes while I proclaimed the gospel to them. God also gave me an opportunity to preach in the prison in Mangu. We were unable to take pictures while we were there, but they gathered about 300 to 400 inmates and allowed me to preach the gospel to them for about an hour. Aside from the various opportunities God had given me to preach, Elizabeth and I also had many different Bible studies with the youth in our neighborhood, as well as many different individuals we met in the city. We found that almost everybody was willing to stop and talk to us about the Bible, and almost everyone asked us to do a Bible study with them as well. We also have an open door to preach the gospel and present Bibles to all 24,000 police officers in Zambia. We have already had opportunities to preach and present Bibles to some of the police in Lusaka and Mangu, but there are still many other police officers that, Lord willing, we will be able to reach with the gospel. During the last trip to Mangu, we were given an opportunity to meet the king of Barotseland and to present him and his court with their own copies of the Bible. This king is the 4th most powerful king in Africa. After presenting him the Bible, he asked us to pray for God's blessings on Barotseland. Everywhere we look in Zambia, we see open doors. God has laid it on our hearts to return to Zambia to live there full time, and that burden has clearly been evidenced in our sending church as well.
As you can tell from the presentation that you've listened to, God is opening the doors for our church to do ministry in Zambia, Africa, and the world. Truly, God has set before us a great and open door. It's the desire of our church to preach the gospel to every creature and to every place on planet Earth. And as we walk through the open doors that God has given to us in Zambia, we're also confident that God has called Jacob and Elizabeth Ray to lead our efforts in Zambia and, God willing, into Africa. It has been a pleasure for me to work with Jacob and Elizabeth for the last couple of years as they've served God in our church here in Wenatchee, and then as they've obeyed God to go where He has prepared them for in the world. And it's my pleasure to wholeheartedly recommend them and ask that your church pray about partnering with them in support and for the Great Commission in Africa.